fax machine the first time.
Maybe not.
This is Michelle.
Yes, Ms. Rand, this is Paul Holvey. I'm a state representative in Salem right now, and I'm in public hearing. Chair of the Consumer Protection Committee, and Representative Chip Shields has arranged for us to call you to provide some testimony on a bill that he is proposing that the state legislature get a report from state chartered banks that are receiving TARP funds, and providing some transparency on I assume what they're doing with those funds, and so we're providing you an opportunity to testify on that concept.
Okay.
And you need to identify yourself too for the record, please.
This is Michelle Rand.
Thank you. Go ahead and continue.
Sure. Chip brought this up to me some time ago as far as providing transparency and maybe some oversight from the state level for banks that were doing business in Oregon that had taken TARP funds. And while I'm not particularly a fan of more regulation, and I feel that the banks are somewhat under the gun right now, just trying to manage their own businesses, I am frustrated with the lack of transparency around not just what the banks are doing with the TARP money, but generally how the banks operate in terms of making loans and taking in money. I mean, I've been in business for almost 30 years, and it's very difficult to untangle SEC statements and figure out what's going on in bank accounting. So those are my primary comments. Did you have any questions that you wanted to ask me as far as what I think about this?
Well, I suppose I'm going to ask you a question I've asked previously, is from my perspective, if we were to pass a bill that required banks to report on the TARP funds that they received, what action or what do you think we as a legislature would do with that information?
Well, that wasn't necessarily, what I was thinking about for this bill. One of the things that I asked about in the first place was, what is the purpose of gaining transparency from the legislature's perspective? Is it a social policy where you would then communicate that to constituents and they would have a better feeling about how the banks are being managed? Is it a policy of pressuring the banks towards making more loans, which is very much in the news these days, and a clear frustration on the part of business? I mean, from my perspective, I'm an advocate of better transparency for all corporations. This is, banks are particularly egregious, but I find similar frustrations with other types of both financial companies and other publicly held companies. And from my perspective, it's a frustration just on behalf of the shareholder. We are owners of the business, and my constituency is the shareholder, and I feel that I ought to know more about what's going on.
Okay, well, that's what I asked you, was for your perspective on what we would do with that information. I think you sort of explained it. One, for transparency, so that we know what's going on, and the second would be to provide pressure to cause some sort of action for the utilization of those TARP funds, I assume. So I'm going to open up a couple other questions, if anybody has any for you.
Sure.
Does anyone have any questions for Ms. Rand? Not seeing any. Representative Shields?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think just in closing, I just wanted to comment that when the Oregonian was doing a story on these bills, Jeff Manning of the Oregonian called and said, so, you know, have you seen any indication that there's been malfeasance in these three banks? And I said, no, and I'd like to keep it that way. And I think that's what this is all about, not singling out these banks as if they're doing anything wrong, but to make sure that there's proper transparency and oversight so that we ensure that doesn't happen in the future.
Thank you. And thank you, Ms. Rand, for making yourself available to testify to our committee on this issue.
You're very welcome.
I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Representative Shields?
I'll ask one, Mr. Chair. Go ahead,
Representative Cowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is an area that I know virtually nothing about, and I guess it frightens me a little bit to think of this committee as an oversight body on something that I have such little knowledge base on. So I'd be interested in exploring your thought processes as if that were to be the case, how that would happen, what expertise is available.
Mr.
I think
Chair,
you get what I'm concerned about.
Mr. Chair, Representative Cowan, you also have, of course, a great resource in the Department of Consumer and Business Services, and I would anticipate that they would also be involved in those hearings and to provide expertise and also have them in a systematic way be able to answer questions about state chartered bank regulation. I think also the nice thing about having this in a public forum is you allow other expertise from the public to come and testify and have their say, and I think that's an important piece as well. But I think really it's a pretty simple endeavor where I would think just as part of your regular agenda 3 times over the course of the interim, they would just come back and say, hey, these are the good things that we've done with this money.
Other questions? Representative Gilliam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative, I'm all for the transparency, and we talked briefly about the motivation for this. We want to get credit going, and to the extent that the legislature can help do that is a good idea. Would you be interested in another model that would maybe, if we're not, and as I understood your testimony, we're not asking for a new report. We're asking to know what reports are there or what's in those reports. Would it be possible to go to DCBS first? They summarize or report to the committee or the committee chair, and then the committee chair in the interim. This committee is probably as appropriate as others. What other words would there be? Business and labor. We don't really have a banking committee, do we? Anyway, then at their discretion, and we may not need legislation for this, but nonetheless make a commitment that the chair would decide the report rises to the level of a briefing, a public hearing. Is that a avenue that you'd consider, or do you think we've got to have the 3 and the 1 or whatever it is?
No, Mr. Chair, Representative Gilliam, I'm completely open to discussions. I even suggested to the Bankers Association that I'd be willing to have one of those hearings at your colleague, Representative Schaffler's committee, to see if there might be some type of compromise. So I'm still open to negotiating this. If they'd like to come back to the table, I'd be more than happy to entertain some things.
Follow up, Mr. Chair. Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I think we can work through that. I hope we can. In a way, you're also kicking us in the tail a little bit and saying, what is our responsibility to